Alastair Newton is Senior Political Analyst at Nomura, and he joins me now. Alastair, thank you so much for making it into the studio. Now, it does seem like an incredible, it's almost unthinkable that actually they won't agree on a debt ceiling. Or won't they agree on a debt ceiling?
Well, I think we've got to assume that there will be a deal. Now, the timing of the deal is very open to question, and with all due respect to your introduction, I don't think anybody's counting 6 days anymore. Everybody understands that this is not going to be done by the 2nd of August. So what happens on the 2nd of August is that government will start to shut down, a repetition of 1995 in simple terms. But, Congress has already agreed to sit for another week. There is progress being made. We had a setback yesterday when BEMA was not able to muster either the votes or indeed the savings to put a vote in the House today. But there may well still be a House vote before the end of this week. And so far, markets are showing remarkable forbearance. Now, the dollar's weakening a bit.
Well, they're still looking at August 2nd deadline, probably. They're possibly hoping that there is something in the 11th hour.
I don't think anybody out there, among my client base at least, seriously believes that we're going to see a deal before the end of next week at the earliest.
But so what happens on August 3rd?
No bond redemptions due before the middle of the month.
Okay.
Revenue streams continue to come in. Geithner prioritises spending, and I would bet that even if we get to the 15th of August, and markets are clearly betting the same, you are not going to see the US renege on its sovereign debt obligations.
But Alastair, it hasn't really been priced in onto the markets. I mean, there's a lot of nervousness, but if on August the 3rd we wake up and really concretely we are not going to have a deal before August the 15th, what happens to the markets in those 5-6 days?
I think if it starts to become apparent to markets that we are not going to get a deal easily, if, for example, we were to get a failed vote either in the House or the Senate, and keep in mind that the track from here is probably a House vote on the BEMA bill. Let's assume that's passed. It then goes to the Senate. There'll be modifications to the bill in the Senate. There'll be a vote in the Senate. There'll have to be modifications to get the necessary 60 votes there. And then the amended bill will go back to the House. Now, I think that's going to be the really difficult moment because Eric Cantor and John BEMA are still going to have to keep the Tea Party on the mark on that because the Democrats may well vote against. If we get to the point where one of those votes fails, I think we get a repetition of what happened with the TARP bill back in 2008, where Congress at the House initially voted no. Markets went ballistic. You'll remember US stock markets dropped 10%. Weakening dollar, movement in the yield curve, I don't think that's going to wake Washington up. A 10% drop in stocks would actually shake them out of their relative complacency. But so far, you're right. Markets are not sending a really strong signal to these guys.
But what's the likelihood then that in those, 10 days of uncertainty after August the 2nd, we see, some of the credit agency actually stripping the US from their AAA credit rating?
I think it's getting more likely. It's very hard to say what the credit agencies will do. Clearly, it's risky for them to go and downgrade the US, not only in terms of what it might do in markets, but also in the sense of there are a lot of question marks over the conduct of the credit agencies, and this could maybe do them a disservice. Now, for all that, clearly they can't afford to have their bluff called either. So what happens if one of them, let's say one of them makes a preemptive strike and downgrades in the next few days? We've been talking a lot to our client base about that. I've been talking with our traders on the floor this morning about it. There is clearly going to be a knee-jerk, but probably markets are just going to have to put up with it and recalibrate accordingly. But we don't foresee this as meaning that there's going to be a massive rush out of US Treasuries.
But is that what's going to take for that market fall? I mean, are your traders saying, I'm bracing myself for a 10% fall?
No, nobody's saying that at the moment because everybody is kind of assuming that we are going to get a deal before we get a technical default. And that technical default, just to reiterate, we don't think that happens in the middle of August in any case because we think that Tim Geithner will have enough money to meet the US's sovereign debt obligations. It's going to be ordinary Americans who are going to be suffering. It's going to be the people who get Social Security checks. It's going to be the veterans. I'm going to be in America next week actually working, but if I had the time to be going to a museum or a national park, I think I wouldn't be counting on them being open. It's happened before, and it didn't have a dramatic effect on financial markets in 1995.
But it was possibly different times then. I mean, now we're just trying to, recover from the financial crisis. And if you look all around the world, in fact, it's really the politicians that are now almost taking hostage, taking the economy hostage.
Yeah, you're right. I mean, Washington is much more polarized than it was 16 years ago. There are plenty of conservative Republicans there who they believe deeply and rightly that they were elected to cut government down to size, and they believe deeply and questionably, in my view, that the best way to do that is not to raise the debt ceiling at all, not to raise taxes at all, but actually to force government to cut spending big time. And those are going to be the people who are going to be difficult to keep in line. Now, to be fair, because I don't want to be seen by your viewers as being partisan one way or the other, I have to say that both sides have been guilty of playing politics, looking for electoral advantage. We all saw what happened in '95. Clinton basically was a shoo-in in '96 after Newt Gingrich had shut the government down. Opinion polls are telling us today, contrary to what they were telling us a couple of weeks ago, that for sure nobody in Washington is going to come out of this with any credit, but the Republicans are going to get more of the blame than the Democrats are. Now, that doesn't seem to bother the Tea Party too much, but it certainly worries the GOP leaders.
Alastair, how concerned are you that actually this politicization of the economy is having adverse effects all across the world? We see a lot more protectionism in Southeast Asia. We see the debt crisis here in Europe being really mishandled mostly by the politicians, and we have, of course, this problem in the US.
Well, let's deal with Europe first. I mean, the good news is that I hope your viewers won't take this wrongly, but I find that markets are rather like my former political masters were when I was in government. They can really only focus tightly on one big issue at a time. Last week it was Europe, this week it's the US, next week it's going to be Europe again, because we all know that Europe has not been solved. EFSF, we need to see what the big number is going to be in order to get markets to relax about Italy and Spain. I was in Greece at the end of last week, and I am very concerned that Greece is not going to be able to meet its obligations despite the best efforts of the government, and that sometime before the end of this year we're going to come back to a scenario where the Eurozone leaders are going to be saying, well, hold on a second, you're not holding up your side of the bargain.
I mean, Greece is relatively small. We are also talking about Cyprus now, Portugal, fine. Yeah. Italy and Spain. Yeah. Are you really worried about these two?
I'm concerned enough to be getting on a plane to Rome this afternoon to go and talk to people there.
Because of bond yields, or just because of the actual politics being put in place by the government?
Combination of the two. Now, if we consider what happened over Italy, there's a number of different views about why Italian spreads suddenly moved out. But I would say personally it was a combination of things. First of all, domestic politics, concern about Tremonti's longevity, passing of the budget. That now is all resolved, and yet we're still seeing upward pressure on the Italian yield curve. That suggests to me that the markets are also very concerned about contagion risk, and I don't think it's coincidence that we saw action triggered over Italy after nearly 3 years of market calm over Italy after the demise of Lehman Brothers.
Again, it's that focus, right?
Yeah.
They zone in on something.
Moody's downgrade of Portugal just before then, concerns about Spanish exposure to Portugal, and what would happen if Spain had to be bailed out in terms of Italy's guarantees on 18% of the money which EFSF would have to find to secure Spain in the event of a bailout. So all of that issue is still there. On your broader question on emerging markets, on the whole, I would say that since the demise of Lehman Brothers, we've actually done much better on protectionism than we might have expected. It's the dog which hasn't barked to the extent that it could have done.
A glimmer of hope. Alastair, thank you. We need it.
Pleasure.
Alastair Newton there.